Hebrew Lesson, Part 3, April 26th. Shalom, shalom. And so what the harvest is when God says, I'm going to remove part of the hedge, and I'm going to allow you to reap some of the natural consequences of what you've sown. Now, if he let us that happen in its full capacity, we would be in hell. But when we're talking about chastisement of a son or a daughter, we're talking about the same as I would do as a parent for my child. So when my child's a baby, I put a hedge around them and I protect them. But then let's say they get a little bit older and I say, okay, you're not doing what I told you to do. You're not being obedient. So now there's going to be a consequence for your actions. You're not going to get to play with your toys. You're going to have to go for a timeout. You're not going to get dessert with dinner. That sort of thing. That's chastisement. So this is what God does with us, is he says he's going to do that, but it's not just random. What he literally does is he lifts his hand like he did with Job in the book of Job. He takes down the hedge a little bit, and that's Dan. So in the month that the tribe of Dan is associated with, the month of Tevet, which is hidden goodness, so it's good, but it's hidden goodness, is the month of Dan, the month of chastisement. And that was the month that the Septuagint was completed, was in the month of Tevet. What the Septuagint is God removed a little bit of the hedge as a chastisement on Israel, that because of your disobedience, your intentional transgression, and your stubbornness about it, you had the privilege of reading it directly in the Hebrew. But now, what does God do? He says in the scripture, he scatters them, Israel, to the nations, which is exactly what happened historically, right? And as part of the scattering, he also scatters or disperses the language, just like what happened at the Tower of Babel. So we see a theme. It starts with the Tower of Babel. One language of the entire earth was Hebrew. Then it was split into many languages. Israel was given the Hebrew language through Abraham. There's a scripture verse, I might look it up later, but it says Abraham the Hebrew. And if you look in the lineage between Shem and Abraham, there's a name Eber, and Eber means Hebrew. So, and it says it was in the time of the son of Eber that the Tower of Babel took place and the earth was scattered. So Eber, because of the long lifespans, his lifespan overlapped with Abraham. And the scripture says Abraham was a Hebrew. So the Hebrew language went with God's remnant, with his chosen people. And it always has. But the chastisement on Israel was, you're scattered to the nations, and your language will be scattered. So what happened in 1948, which I haven't looked at my calendar, but that's coming up any day now. It was May 14th, but on the Hebrew calendar, it was the 5th of Iyar. So the Israeli Independence Day is actually not always May 14th. It's on the Hebrew calendar. So this year, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to look it up, but I think it's either the 28th or 29th of April. So this year will be 72 years, which, if you remember that number from the Septuagint, 72 is a significant number. But what started in 1948, and really a little bit before, but really started in 1948, was the Hebrew language was restored. So remember, the Septuagint was in the 2nd century BC, and there was a remnant of the Hebrew language through the scattering amongst the nations in the daily prayers. The Hebrew language was, as I heard somebody put it, in a coma. It was alive. It wasn't dead, but it was It was underground. It was a remnant. And then in 1948, the Hebrew language was resurrected as though in one day. Go ahead.
Ben, do we know why in 1948-47 Ben Yehuda changed the symbols from the paleo up to the more modern day?
Yes. If you remember the story from Daniel, remember when the leader, they were in captivity and the leader saw the handwriting on the wall. It said something like Mene, Tekel, something I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was Hebrew. And he couldn't interpret it, which is strange. And the rabbi's commentary on this scripture is, they called for Daniel to interpret it. But we're talking about a major world empire that has lots of Hebrew knowledge. So they knew the Paleo Hebrew at that time in the story in Daniel. So why did they call Daniel? Why couldn't they read the handwriting on the wall? Was because the handwriting on the wall was written in the Babylonian script or the modern Hebrew. So what the rabbis teach is that the modern Hebrew was actually the original Hebrew that Adam spoke, and the Paleo Hebrew was sort of a early form of, not quite to the same degree, but like we were talking about the Septuagint, was a step backward. So they lost the original alphabet, but they still had the Hebrew language. And then in the time of Daniel and Ezra, which Ezra is a key figure in Jewish history, wrote a book of the Bible, but he also wrote the prayer book, the weekly Bible readings, the canon of the Old Testament, Ezra and the Great Assembly of 120, which is why there's 120 seats in the Israeli parliament today, was because of the Great Assembly under Ezra, Mordecai, Malachi, Daniel. They all had their hand in restoring the modern Hebrew alphabet. So whenever Ben Yehuda came up with Hebrew for Israel, he used the modern alphabet with a Jewish understanding that that would be the more correct original alphabet. So this shocks a lot of people who have been learning the Paleo, and they're like, what? I thought the Paleo was the more authentic ancient one. But see what the Aleph is, these are prophetic symbols. So when you take the Aleph, what it actually is, and you may have seen this, I don't know, is the Vav, and these are Hebrew letters. So the Vav is the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and the Yod is the 10th. So what you have here is you have 2 Yods and a Vav. And this gets into a deeper prophetic interpretation. Now, it doesn't say that this is wrong, the pictograph, but there's levels, right? So the pictograph is one step removed. The prophetic Hebrew is what I like to call it, because I like that term better than Babylonian or modern. It's open but hidden, right? It's hidden in plain view, because to the secular Israeli, it's just an alphabet. But when you start breaking it up like this and looking into the prophetic symbols that underlie the letters, you get Yod, Yod, and Vav. So the Vav is the connection. It's a nail. It connects 2 things together. And then the Yod is the hand. So what the rabbis say this symbolizes is the hand of heaven and the hand on earth. So this is the connection of the heavens and the earth. So it's deep. Prophetic pictures. This script is actually a prophetic symbolism, and there's many hidden messages. I'm just giving you a sampling within the Hebrew prophetic pictures. So that's why this script is considered to be the authentic one. With Israel becoming a nation again, you began to see the rise of another group the Hebrew Roots movement. And in saying that, I run the danger that people have certain associations with camps, that exist. And that's not what I mean by it. But what I mean is in a more biblical sense, in a more prophetic sense of what God is doing, whether people get it exactly right in their congregation or their movement is another question. But God is restoring to the church the Hebrew Yeshua. God has taken away the Greek Jesus and restoring the Hebrew Yeshua to the church. That was something that was lost. But in the original church, up until 70 AD, when Israel was dispersed and ceased to be a nation, the majority of the early church was Jewish believers. The day of Pentecost, the 3,000 that were saved, were all Jewish. Now, it isn't that there weren't Gentiles in the church, but the Gentile dominance of the church in both numbers and influence started in 70 AD when Israel ceased to be a nation. So the scripture in Romans talks about the time of the Gentiles. So the time of the Gentiles, biblically speaking, this is my interpretation, but not mine alone, refers to when Israel ceased to be a nation. When Israel became a nation again, we're in a transition time, but now we have the rise of the Jewish element of the church again. So we're in that gray area, when the day ends, and it's in a biblical day, the day starts in the evening. So you have that time period in the evening if you're out, and you say it's getting dark. So now I guess scientifically somebody could try to measure the exact second when it gets dark, meaning the new day starts and the old day ends, right? But in human terms, when we look at it with, see, this is a little dividing wall here, right? And there's this gray area that we call dusk, the gray, right? It's not quite dark, but it's getting dark. So are we still in the old day, or are we in the new day? And then there's probably scientifically an exact second, but to the human eye that's not that exact, we have this gray transition area, right, between one day and the next, between day and night. So you have this gray area. So we're in the gray area starting in 1948, where we're going from this period of hiddenness or darkness, where the Jewish element of the church was in the dark. But in 1948, I guess that would be more comparable to dawn rather than dusk. But let's say the sun's just starting to rise. And at first, it's still halfway dark, right? Half light, half dark. So what happened with 1948 is we saw this half darkness, half light, where the restoration of the one new man, which is both Jewish and Gentile, started in 1948 with the nation of Israel. And it's not a coincidence that the Messianic Jewish movement, there was a remnant through all history, but you could almost not find them. Remember what I said earlier about the chastisement of the Lord? So theologically, what's happening there, when the state of Israel was done away with, it took a couple hundred years, but around 300 AD, right, you had the full changing of day to night, or night to day, depending on which perspective you're looking at it. So you have the rise of the Gentiles, right? If you're familiar with the passage in Romans, it says, right, the time of the Gentiles. And then when the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled, then you have the rise of the Jewish element of the church once again, which is what we're living now in that transition. Now, it isn't meant to be that the Jewish takes over and the Gentile disappears. It's meant to be one new man. That's God's end game. And I'm tying that in with the Hebrew language was restored in 1948. So it's being restored to the church. And if you watch Israel, that's God's prophetic timepiece, his prophetic picture for the church to watch is Israel. So that's what we're seeing in the big picture. End of Hebrew lesson, April 26th, Part 3. Shalom, shalom.